Hello everyone, I'm Julia Magew, the recently retired, hello, I'm seeing lots of friends everywhere, recently retired, not really, health editor of The Age, and I'm delighted to be here today. I was really pleased that Mark Baker asked me to come and moderate this lunch because in my time as a journalist, I have really loved covering this topic, so thank you for having me. Now, I'd like to introduce Professor Bob Jones, who, amongst many other things I'm sure, is the Director of the Victorian Adult and Paediatric Liver Transplant Unit. After starting his transplant surgery career focused mainly on kidneys, he moved on to livers in the 1980s and received training from the pioneer of liver transplants, Thomas Starzl, in the US. Professor Jones has now done more than 900 liver transplants, and his unit also started doing intestinal transplants in 2010. I don't know Bob that well personally, but when I asked around about the sort of person he is, I got some very impressive descriptions. Some of your colleagues describe you as a superb surgeon, an absolute legend. Patients call you a miracle worker. I've always been a little bit funny about the use of the word miracle when it comes to science, but I'll let you have it. And I particularly like this comment from a patient of yours who you looked after over 23 years, Jay Franklin, who I think is here today, or maybe not. He's too sick and hasn't been able to make it. He said that Bob is the most beautiful, warm, caring, sympathetic, and approachable man I've ever met. That's the kind of doctor I'd like to see. So, Bob, thank you for coming to talk to us today. Take it away.
Well, Michael, Mark, thank you very much for the invitation, and Julia, thank you for that somewhat over-the-top introduction. It's completely over the top, and there are a few lies in there as well. Look, it's my pleasure to be at the Press Club today. I'm a very keen favourite of the press, particularly in this polarised society in which we live, and I've always wanted to be a member of a club, so it's a really nice combination today and synergy to be here. Transplantation is an extraordinary event. It's been around for quite a long time, but it's extraordinary because of the biology and the immunology and the technology. But it's even more extraordinary because of the incredible journey that patients go through. And we've got 3 patients here today, and in the conversation I think we're going to hear from them, and that's probably much more interesting. And perhaps the most extraordinary part of it is that none of it would happen without this gift from someone else. It's this beautiful gift of an organ from a dying Australian to another Australian who is often always close to death as well. So I just show a picture there of a liver, which is something that I've been involved with for some time. And as Julia mentioned, I started out in kidney transplantation in the UK, and it very rapidly became clear that we were at the bottom of the pecking order. We would get in a taxi and drive through the fog. It was like this every night in the UK in Oxford. And we'd arrive in a taxi, and then the heart team would fly in a helicopter, and the lung team would fly in a helicopter, and then they'd leave, and we'd close up and get back in the cab. So it was very clear that we had to move up in the world. So that's a beautiful human functioning liver. And as a surgeon, when you see these beautiful organs, that organ, within minutes of your heart stopping, within minutes of death, deteriorates and is unusable. So just in purely practical terms, it's just a wonderful thing that we can reuse it and recycle it, and it doesn't disappear. And what's unique about that liver there is that it really shouldn't be there, because just a few hours ago it belonged to someone else. Slides. Mike, where's the slide holder? Yeah. So transplantation, relatively new. The very first successful liver transplant, 1954, and that guy on the right, Joseph Murray, got a Nobel Prize for transplanting a kidney between these 2 identical twin brothers. And if you had kidney failure in the 50s and 60s, you died miserably, unless you just were fortunate enough to have an identical twin. And these 2 guys are the first surviving renal transplants in the world. And that kidney, I'm not sure which way it went between the 2 of them because they're identical and you can't tell, lasted many, many years. Next slide, please. And this guy I just want to pay a little bit of recognition to. In my career, nearly all the pioneers of transplantation were alive. So I've had a working career where all the guys who worked out how to do this were still around, and they're just sort of falling off the perch at the moment. And Tom Starzl is one of those. Tom should have won a Nobel Prize, but he stood on so many toes, and I think Darren has met him and interviewed him. There was no way that he would do that, but he should have. He's the guy that actually worked out how to do renal transplants for the rest of us in the 1960s. And at that same time, he started to do liver transplants. This is extraordinary. This is at a time when transplantation was barely off the ground. And the other extraordinary thing about transplantation is that most of the pioneering work and experimentation was done in human beings. And there's an old saying in transplantation that human experimentation showed that it was safe to do in animals. And you wouldn't be able to do this now because we would have ethics committees and limitations. And Tom was an extraordinary fellow. And this, in 1967, he had barely sorted out kidney transplants, started doing liver transplants. And the first 7 patients were all children and nearly all died on the operating table. And it wasn't until 1960, if we just go back, 1969, that he had a survivor. And in fact, the picture there shows the first 3 surviving transplant patients in the world. And notice that they're all children. And you think, why would somebody kill 7 children in a row and still keep going? Well, it takes a lot of stamina and courage to do that. But the reason was, shown in the next slide, because this is what happened to children with certain diseases. They died of liver failure. And this is a child dying of liver failure. Was dead in about a week after this. And you die of malnutrition and starvation and the most horrible death. So it's understandable why you might want to save these children. Next slide, please. And the other really significant event, because prior to about 1980, the survival in transplants was about 25%. So those patients that went in, for every 4 patients that went in, 1 would make it. And that was an extraordinary, and patients still went through that. And those patients who died contributed to the knowledge that allowed further patients to survive. But around 1980, this guy working for Sandoz, looking for chemotherapy drugs for cancer, discovered this drug called cyclosporin in this fungus. And Sandoz, who are now one of the world's biggest drug companies, changed their name to Novartis following a merger, required every single member of their staff, if they ever went on holiday, they issued you with these sealed plastic bags and you had to bring back soil samples from wherever you were around the world. They couldn't do that now, of course. And these soil samples, one of them from a fjord in Norway, grew this fungus and they found this chemical that no one had ever seen. And it turned out to be a totally useless chemotherapy drug. But just through serendipity, this guy, John Burrell, found out that it was extraordinarily powerful immunosuppressant. It was this drug that really then went on to save hundreds of thousands of lives with allowing people to survive transplantation. Next slide, please. So it wasn't all straight sailing. This is a very controversial area. And even in the 80s, when I became involved, there was huge controversy about whether we should be doing this. And this is an editorial in the Medical Journal of Australia just saying that we shouldn't be doing this. It was immoral, it was experimentation, and subsequently, further article by a lawyer, a legal ethicist, if at the next slide. Next slide. And this, again, just, if you can read it, it's extraordinarily critical. So the pioneers of this procedure, even in the 80s here in Australia, were under tremendous pressure to bail out and not do this. Next slide, please. So, very simple operation. So it's sort of some ways high-tech, but actually the actual operation is extraordinarily basic. And Larry, who's here and is the anaesthetist, has all the hard stuff to do. Whereas the surgeon, we have scissors, we have sutures. It's all very basic. The actual plumbing part of it's quite basic to end up with a big hole at the top and to end up with a normal shiny liver at the bottom that's working. Next slide, please. Lots of tubes and pipes to sew together, and that's the kind of fun part for anyone surgeon who likes plumbing things together. And a bit of high-tech stuff that Larry would run, all these machines, and you can see our technician there reading the manual on how to operate it on the right. And in some ways, the anaesthetic for this operation is extraordinary. It takes hours to get ready. There are pipes and tubes everywhere, and sometimes you come in and you just look at this beautifully. You've got to be a bit obsessive-compulsive to be an anaesthetist, and you look at these tubes and pipes and often marvel at the intricacy and how they don't make mistakes and get the tubes in the wrong place. All these machines are needed to get someone like Darren, Andrew through the operation, or Tom. Next slide. And there's some weird things about liver. This is a beautiful shot of a liver transplant being done under that coloured light, and it's sort of a mood lighting, and we'd like to have this for all our transplants, except it made it quite hard to see. And this patient has a bizarre condition where they cannot be exposed to normal light. Normal light frequencies, they get massive sunburn and die of third-degree burns. So it has to live her life covered up, protected, sheltered, and when you have the transplant, it also has to be done under this light frequency, which reduces the light to this single yellow frequency, which is safe. So why get involved? Well, it's still an extraordinary procedure, despite us, this basic thing of taking a liver and sticking it in someone else. It transforms people. It is a miracle. You take a patient on the right who's as close to death as you can get, in fact, with many doctors saying, why don't we bail out? And a year later, on the left, although his wife still looks pretty stressed in that shot. Back to pretty normal. Not quite normal, but pretty normal. Next slide. So you can take a liver and chop bits off it. Little tiny corner can be chopped off and put into a baby. So any one of us adults, we could take the corner of your liver and stick it into a 7-kilo kid who might be only 5 or 6 months old. And then the other big bit, we can stick into an adult. So you can get 2 transplants out of 1. And this is a picture of a liver being cut, and on the left side is that liver in 2 little bits, all being done in a nice way. I rather like that shot on the right because it's lots of hands in there, and in fact, a couple of those hands are Tom Stousel's. So it's one of my favourite shots. And little kids who couldn't, be enchanted by little sick babies who. And the extraordinary thing is, parents of these are sick since birth. And these children have never been well. So it's extraordinary at about a year or so if you transplant them 5 months. Parents take these kids home, they don't know their children, they've never seen them well. In fact, just recently one of the mothers came back and said her little son, who was about 3, had attention deficit disorder, and she was rapidly disabused of that by the other mums who said he's just basically now gone to be normal. He previously just lay there. And another favourite story is one of our mums who donated part of her liver to her little child. Everyone's very proud. She survived, he survived. She takes him home, and the next day we got an urgent call from the children's hospital. So he'd been readmitted because he's fallen on his head and he's got a brain hemorrhage, minor brain hemorrhage. Luckily it all settled down. She said, but I put him on the table to change his nappy and he rolled off. She's never done that before. So now we've built that into our warning system. Next slide, please. Lots of people, all those teams, this is a procedure that needs the entire hospital to get them through. And the surgical bit is really the easy part. It's all the other stuff. And down the bottom in green, Helen, the organ donation system, and that's why we're here today to talk about it. None of this would be there without that green bit. Next slide, please. And again, just a lovely photo on the left is a picture from one of our patients who we took a photograph of him having his transplant. He was an artist, and then he painted the picture of himself on the operating table. And he's the guy in the middle there somewhere. You can just see. Next slide. And the other lovely thing is watching kids grow up, from that 1-year-old on the right who's never been well to that little bouncy sister in the middle, whom you would never have known this extraordinary personality. And not only is she now 20 years down the track, she has the most magnificent singing voice. And if I'd known we had sound, I would have played the video from her. She's a stunning songstress. And we would never have known that because she would have died within weeks of that original photograph on the right. Growing up, this young lady brought that Deb photo, and our nurses were all marvelling over how lovely it was because she and her mum had made the dress. But actually what's crucial about that photograph is she would not have been there without organ donation and transplantation. Next slide. Little boy waiting for a transplant. He again has another bizarre and very rare condition where he survives by living in that light box 16 hours a day at least. And he shouldn't be wearing his jeans. He just did that for the photo because he's best off naked, because the more of his skin is exposed to that light, the less time he has to spend in the box. And that is instantly cured by liver transplantation. So from going entire life living in that box to being like a normal kid and being able to go to school. Next slide. So ethics, lots and lots of issues to do with ethics of organ donation. I mean, how do we use these organs and who should make the decision? We're short of them. Should we just do it on a functional basis? Lots of very interesting and challenging ethical decisions about organ utilization and use. So let's just take a little example. I mean, everyone sort of agreed, I think we should transplant children. I mean, I'm sorry, Darren, but if it's between you and Imogen, you know, there's a cute factor there. So we're already making value judgments that we, as a community, would prefer to transplant children than older patients. But, you know, what about Imogen versus a mother who might have 3 children? You know, there are lots of issues as to where you might draw the line. Next slide. And do you take children to the age of 18 and give them preference, and suddenly at the age of 18 and one day you drop them down? Or should we just, you know, have a progressive age? The older you are, the lower we put you on the wait list. So there are lots of very interesting and controversial things. Or do we look after you as an individual, or should we look after the community? I mean, for example, if we're going to put a liver into someone and it's only got a 50-50 chance of making it, wouldn't it be better to use that precious organ in someone who's got a 90% chance of making it? And if you were donating your liver, would you want it to be around in 20 years, or would you want us to use it in someone who may not survive? And the other interesting question is, who owns that liver? If you make a will, you can decide to leave things to the old lost dogs home and put stipulations on it. And people ask, well, why can't I do that about my organs? And it's one of the extraordinary things about organ donation that it's exceptionally rare for anyone to even consider that. So I think when you actually come to organ donation, it touches that sort of existential part of existence. And most people, when they're dying or someone in their family is dying, make this extraordinary gift without any sense of where it's going or where it's going to be used. It's almost the most profound gift you can give, just so that some of the family doesn't have to go through the same trauma that your family's going through. And who makes the decisions? Well, there's lots of interesting room for debate. And I'll just finish off, I think, with the next slide. So lots of progressive things happening, so I'll just finish up with and that's a human liver on the right-hand side in that box, and that's a whole lot of machinery and pumps. And rather than sticking the liver in an esky, we're now going to try and stick it on a heart-lung machine where we think it will preserve it and make it work better. And that's sort of currently what we're playing with at the moment. It'll enable us to use more livers, and it might enable us to also leave them on that machine overnight and start in the morning instead of having to go all night. So there's a bit of self-interest in this. And that's just a lovely shot of one of our patients. And I bet you can't tell which one is the patient. It's the bloke on the right. And he survived really because his now wife was a nurse, and she kept him alive. Blokes are hopeless at looking after themselves, and he's only alive because she looked after him before his transplant. So at that point, I'll stop. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that, Bob. Great talk. Could I please welcome Darren Hinch, who has had a very colourful history. He's a liver transplant recipient, former prisoner, oldest man to become a senator.
That's right.
I'm very pleased that you're on this panel. And we've also got Tom Stotnicki, who is a business journalist who very recently received a liver transplant, and Andrew Chapman, a photographer who also received a a transplant. And I believe most, if not all of you, had some contact with Bob and his team for your transplants, but perhaps you can tell us all about that. So please come up to the stage and we'll figure out how the panel will sit. Welcome everybody. I just wanted to start by asking Bob a question. Given the concerns about the size of the waiting list and the supply of donors, it occurred to me that we've got a very current issue that's being debated about assisted dying and the potential for us to have euthanasia for terminally ill people in Victoria. What do you make of that in terms of how it might affect the supply of donated organs? Do you anticipate that people who might choose to end their life through euthanasia might be able to also donate their organs? And do you think that the controlled fashion in which they might die will facilitate more organ donation?
Well, that's a really hot topic. We should get to the euthanasia one first, I think. Look, I think the issue of organ donation, this is very much a community decision. These are your organs, and it's a community that has to decide how they're used. And of course there's a potential if someone's doing that, but it's certainly a minefield of ethical considerations, and it opens the gate, of course, to, are we going to be killing people for organs? Or, you can imagine the conflict of interest involved in that. But we're very much guided by the community, and it's why it has to be transparent and very, very open. And so in that decision-making slide as to who makes the decisions, really the medics, us, the teams, the nurses, are really doing what we think the community wants. And in fact, community really have to have a big input into that. So I'm sidestepping that question, Julia.
You sure are. Do you have a personal view on it?
Look, it's stunning that it happens at all, really. When you think about it, you have sudden death, unexpected. This may involve a child. And across town, one family's in chaos, and across town there's a family hoping for new life. And you're going to remove the organs from the dead person and put them into... And our team goes from one to the other. It's an extraordinary process. I think it's stunning that it happens at all. And we don't want to do anything, certainly, that might imperil that. But I'd love to see a debate on that.
Perhaps we'll get the others to share their views on this, but I've just realised that you were all given approximately 3 minutes to talk about your experience of this. So perhaps, Darren, you can start and then we'll get to some more questions.
Okay, now my maiden speech meant to run 20 minutes, ran 47, so wind me up after 3. Okay?
I will.
2,218 is a very important number to me because that's how many days I've been alive since Bob and Larry and the team transplanted me. 2,218 more days. I wouldn't have been here. Heath Gardner was my donor. I'm lucky to know my donor's family. His father and his sister Kimberly, they contacted me months after I'd had the operation and said, "We think it's you." And it was so, the night he died by his own hand, he was 27, he would have turned 28 next day. Heath Gardner, his father, said, "We're turning the machines off," and said to his daughter, she arrived in a taxi, "They've asked me to donate his organs, what do you reckon?" And she said, "Why not?" It turns out that my donor was a drug user and a drug dealer. My sister said, "Typical you, why couldn't he be a 50-year-old accountant who played lawn bowls?" And Bob, at the time, in the car I was going to have the operation, Bob called me up and told me all this, and I hung up, and my wife, Chanel, said, "That means you could have Hep A, Hep B, Hep B, Hep C, or even AIDS." And when I called Bob, Bob called back as if he'd heard the conversation and spelled the same thing out. But let me tell you quickly, 2,218 days ago, there I was having a transplant. Last week, I was on the Syrian border under armed guards, went to Jordan, went to Petra, in one day walked 15 kilometres, according to my iPhone, climbed 44 stories to get to the monastery at Petra in 45-degree heat, and I felt fantastic. And that's because of this team have done it for me. I have a journalist for 55 years, I was, before I jumped the shark. I don't use, especially being a year in Canberra, I don't hold many people in awe. The man to my right I think is an awesome man. He's one of the most amazing people I've ever met in my life, and it's just extraordinary. People love you, Bob, because of what you've done and what you can do and what Larry and team does. Although you said to me, I don't want to be the man who killed, be remembered as the man who killed Darren Hinch, and I said, don't you want to be a folk hero? But quickly, one more thing is that I've had talks to Malcolm Turnbull about this. I said to him just only 2 weeks ago, we're talking about what I want. I want a living will. I used to be opt-out in favour, now I'm opt-in plus, which means if you make a living will, you go on the register, you cannot be taken off by your family. I said to Malcolm, I said, now look, if you die tomorrow, as some people wish you would, Lucy, if she changes her mind and doesn't want you to be a donor, it won't happen. He said, how can that be? I said, well, that's the way it is. So he's gone back now, his staff have gone back to the authority, and they will come back with a recommendation, and I believe I'll get this living will, because as Bob has told me in the past, he could transplant 50 more people a year, and that's one a week. 50 more people could be alive if they could get the livers. So that's my two goals on this area of my platform. One was to get 1 million more people on the register. The app now is coming along. That's going to be easier for people to get onto it. But I want this living will where when you put your name on that list, say, I will be a donor, you will be a donor.
Thank you. Before we move to you, Tom, can I just ask what Malcolm's reaction to that was?
The fact that people want him dead. No, that wouldn't come as a surprise to him. No, he's very encouraging about it. I was a Donate Life ambassador until they sacked me because I was in favour of opt-out. I've now come around to the idea that 6 states, I think, in America are doing this now, this opt-in plus. So I call it a living will, and if we can get that through, then I think it'll be a huge advance. Because, if you... especially with children, you send your little girl off to school at 9 years old in the morning, and 12 hours later, because of some tragedy, you're in an intensive care unit of a hospital being asked, will you donate your kids' organs? So you can understand that awful trauma for the family. But especially if you're an adult and your family doesn't want you to have it, well, you made the will, it's your right, and I think it's a very important one.
Thank you, Darren. Okay, Tom, please tell us about your experience.
Yeah, look, I haven't had my organ for 2,000 odd days. It's probably been about 40, not that I'm counting, but I got transplanted about 6.5 weeks ago, and I actually got discharged from hospital last Thursday, so I'm still a little bit fragile, to say the least. I guess the thing about it that strikes me is just how much liver disease affects your life. And in a way, I admire Darren enormously because he obviously had liver disease for quite some time, and he managed to soldier on with it. I guess I probably felt now, or in hindsight, that it really affected me personally, professionally, for probably about 20 years. And that, in a sense, that here I am in my late 50s, and I feel like I'm getting a chance for a new lease on life, which is just an amazing miracle as far as I'm concerned. I think the other thing is that in terms of my personal experience, I was diagnosed with liver cancer just over a year ago, and this was in Canberra, which is where I normally reside, and I was told by the people at Canberra Hospital that I had a year to live, and there was nothing that could be done. That was very hard to take. I fell into a relatively deep depression for a few weeks until a few of my friends, medical friends here in Melbourne, a few of my medical friends here in Melbourne really came to the party, and I'm talking about a number of them are in the audience. Dr. Nathan Pinskia, one of my oldest friends, Dr. Mukesh Akawell, formerly president of the AMA, who's a very long-standing friend of mine as well. There were a number of others as well, and also my GP in Canberra, who is Trina Jeffrey, who was an absolute trooper. What they managed to do between them was to get me an opportunity for consultations with people here in Melbourne associated with the Austin, particularly Paul Gow, who works very closely with Bob. And although I was outside what they call the protocols for a transplant at that stage, Paul sort of had a look at the scans and said, well, look, we'll refer you to a interventional radiologist, a guy called Mark Goodwin, who I think worked with Darren as well. And basically, we'll do that privately and we'll see what happens. The result was that I went through four courses of chemo, what's called TASTE treatment, which is a type of chemo, over a period of about 6 months, which managed to shrink the tumours that I had, the liver cancer, to the stage that I became a potential candidate for a transplant. So I guess the one thing that really emerged from that, as far as I'm concerned, is that it's very important for people that face difficult, that are faced with a difficult medical prognosis, to seek out those second opinions and third opinions if need be, to fight the good fight, if you like, because it's just too easy to accept. Well, it's not too easy. It's a tragedy. I think if people basically accept a conclusion, even from a well-qualified medico, which is really not the case, as it was, as you can see. Here I am, a year after that prognosis, or after being told that I had a year to live, and I'm still around. And I hope to be for quite a number of years yet, and to have the opportunity to spend a lot more time with my 3 grandchildren. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Tom. Now we'll pass it to Andrew, who also was just telling me about his extraordinary will to live since receiving his transplant. So tell us about your experience.
Thanks, Julia. I want to start back in the mid-1990s, and I was a photographer working freelance with Time magazine, and I was assigned to go out to the Austin Hospital. There was a lot of open heart surgery happening there at the time, and I found it one of the most interesting jobs I'd ever done to date at that point. Halfway through the operation, a surgeon walked in from the next operating theatre and was just chewing the fat with the other surgeons, and I was introduced, and I think it was you, Bob, but I can't be 100% sure on that. Anyway, he said, oh, look, we're doing a liver transplant, would you like to have a look? So I said, sure. So I wandered in, and there's this body lying there on the operating theatre with this huge hole in the stomach and a new liver waiting to go in, and they'd spent 7 hours pulling that liver out. And I was pretty amazed by that. And I actually took a couple of photographs, which I think I've given the liver transplant unit since. Anyway, little did I know that 16 years later, those people, that same team would be responsible for saving my life. And I find that a really extraordinary thing. In 2000, I found out that I'd had a fairly common genetic condition called hemochromatosis. I bet you there's somebody in the room who's got it. It's fairly common. It's an iron overload condition, and it had built up to a point in me where it had really started attacking all my organs, in particular my liver. I staggered on with it for another 11 years, and at the end of 2010, I looked in the mirror one morning and I was going yellow, and I thought, I know where I'm going here. I just watched, about 8 months earlier, I watched my brother die from liver cancer, and I knew exactly where I was heading. I spent the next 2 months in the the Alfred Hospital, and then transferred to the Austin. And I grew so weak that one day I started bleeding through small varices in the throat. They threw me into a coma. I stayed in a coma for 5 days. I had about 2 days left in the tank when I was fortunate enough, and somebody else, I guess, was unfortunate enough to lose their life, and I received a liver transplant. It's been a long recovery. I had my kidneys have stopped working, and I've only come back to 20%, and I had a number of other conditions, but I'm glad to say that I always had the will to live, to get back out on the road and to do the things I've loved, and I've kind of gone at that with a bit of a vengeance ever since. That culminated, should I say, last July, with after quite a few months of work, I did a project with Donate Life Victoria where we photographed the pathway of transplantation, and it was a very difficult process. We were graciously allowed to photograph somebody's life ending, being pulled off, withdrawn from life support, and the surgeons preparing to remove organs from that person. We photographed corneal eye surgery and watched the restoration of sight for a gentleman out at Bayswater. And the most, I find it a real honour to have photographed a liver transplant by the people who saved my life last year. And I went in and I spent about 13 and a half hours last July photographing Bob saving the life of a young 34-year-old man, again from the outer eastern suburbs of Melbourne. And it's amazing to watch Bob work. I mean, these two haven't had that privilege, obviously, but I've watched Bob doing 2 transplants now, probably 3 if I assume that was you in the first one.
I stood there and watched him once.
Oh, you have watched him, sorry.
About 10 hours we were there, and they don't stop, they don't have a coffee, they don't have a pee, they don't do anything. They stand there and concentrate for about 10 hours straight. It's awesome.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Bob just stands there and he works, and like he usually works for around about, I think, 6 hours without stopping. Now, you imagine standing anywhere doing the dishes for 6 hours, you'd be knackered. He has got the most incredible strength of character and stamina that I've ever seen. It's true what everybody says. I know the staff love him to bits. I know the patients love him to bits, and the 3 of us here, I'm sure, can't be any more grateful than we are for what he and his team. There's a huge, extensive team that are involved in getting us back on the road. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Turns out I was not being over the top, Bob, in my opening. Bob, can I just ask you another sticky question? I've always found the process by which you select recipients to be a little bit secretive, probably not deliberately secretive, but complicated. There was a fantastic scene in the Netflix series House of Cards where the US president frog-leaped another man to receive a liver. I'm just wondering, how do you, who makes the decision about who will get the next liver when it comes up? And what are the sort of protections in place to make sure that Malcolm Turnbull or Darren Hinch or whoever is not going to kind of be seen as a sort of more valuable recipient than somebody else?
Look, we are very transparent about it. And just a little anecdotal story. when Darren came along, it was quite clear that he was sick and needed a transplant and probably should have gone up the list. You know, you can walk in on Monday and be top of the list. You could walk in on Monday and be bottom and wait a year or more. And it was pretty obvious that Darren should have been up. In fact, because he was Darren, it was sort of prejudicial. We thought we'd better not do him too soon because it will look like he's getting favouritism.
He put me off for 3 months, he told me later on. So I did get special treatment. I got treated that way.
And in fact, at the end, Darren had recurrent cancer, and we thought we might have missed the boat. So we have a system where we have a very open house. We have about 20, 30 people meet every week, and we put the patients up, and then we look at them in terms of, we have a priority of basically sickest first. And everybody agrees. So we might have 70 patients on the list in various groups, and in those groups we'll go 1 to 5. And when the donor comes up, it's already been pre-decided. But every day it's reviewed, because you might be number 5 today, but by tomorrow morning you might be number 1. So it's very fluid, a little bit like you, Michael. You know, you're never sure what's going to happen each day. And we're very transparent, and we have it so that anyone in the staff can, you know, say, look, I think he should be up the top of the list. And the criteria for that is just based on really how crook you are and whether you're going to survive. The problem, of course, is that we have some patients who are actually really crook, like the girl under the yellow light. She's not going to die, so she will always permanently remain at the bottom of the list because we're doing her for something other than death. She can't live, she can't get in a taxi without being covered. And when she gets in a taxi, she has to have a taxi with blinds on it. So the little boy in the box isn't going to die if he stays in the box. So it's extraordinarily tricky, Julia, to actually make those decisions. But there's a sort of consensus, and we believe we have to do. Just a little example, the community thinks we should do kids. Kids should, there's almost universal consensus. If we have a young donor, there's universal consensus that should be used in a young. I mean, should we use a 12-year-old beautiful organ in a 60-year-old? And the community consensus is that, you know, we should be using it in a child. So there are some broad, but there's no easy answer. But it is open and transparent. Again, it's a community-based decision.
It's fascinating. I'm being a hog, so are there questions in the audience? Yes, I can see one right here. We'll bring a mic to you. And has anyone else got a burning question? Okay, good. We'll go to you after this lady here.
Hi, I'm Marcy Pinskia. If I could ask you a question, please. You mentioned earlier that there was a baby that had a transplant because its mother gave a small portion of her liver. I was just wondering, do many adults put their hands up to give portions, small portions of their liver to enable you to do more donations to babies or small children, healthy people?
Look, again, there's not a parent that brings a child where they don't volunteer to do that. But contributing a chunk of your liver carries a significant death rate. If we took the right lobe, there's a really significant chance of death in the donor, or at least significant complications that might, you know, so if you've got a young mum who's got 2 other kids and you're potentially going to make them orphans, I mean, it's an operation that's got a 200% risk of mortality, both the child and the parent. So it's a very big question as to, you know, it's really, really difficult. And the other problem is, of course, it's surgeons who are operating on the parent. You're operating on a totally healthy, well person. It's a wonderful opportunity to operate on them, but nobody likes doing that. Because if you do enough, you will end up running into trouble. So the answer is, if we had enough cadaveric dead patients who donated, we wouldn't need to do that.
Can I just make one quick point? Because Bob mentioned Thomas Starzl, the man who invented liver transplants, and was also involved in getting tacrolimus, the pills, the ones that I take and you may take. A year after my transplant, I went to New York and then flew down to Pittsburgh to see Thomas Starzl and just say thank you, because if he hadn't done it, I wouldn't be here. And the Thomas Starzl Institute, where you worked with others, Thomas Starzl, is this huge skyscraper building in Pittsburgh. Thomas Starzl didn't work out of that building. He worked out of a little ramshackle joint across the road because they wouldn't let his dogs into his into the building, the hospital. So he worked out of this little funny place across the road. I had lunch with him, flew back to New York, and I get an email from Starzl, who died only about 2 months ago. And Starzl wrote to me and he said, "Darren, it was an honour to meet you." And I thought, hang on a flash, it's the other way around. You know, I'm the one, it's an honour. But he said, "It was an honour to meet you, and to see in you the international ripples of my crazy dream from all those years ago. And that was Thomas Starrs, the most extraordinary man. And one other quick thing on a lighter note is that I was out of hospital from my transplant. I was on 3AW the afternoon, that very afternoon of having the operation, the transplant. 8 days, I think I was out and home. And the very next day, had to go to court to be sentenced for contempt of court, for suppression orders breaching. And this bloke came with me. So I'm sitting in court, and I was allowed to sit down, not stand, by Rosenschweig, the magistrate. My surgeon is there taking my pulse while I'm being sentenced to 5 months of house arrest. I think that Bob bribed the judge because he thought I'd be back at work in a month. If I get 5 months of house arrest, I had to relax and I had to recover.
Okay, we've got another question.
Hi, I'm Nathan Pinsky. As Tom mentioned, I'm probably one of his oldest long-standing friends. I'm also the chair of the College of GPs e-Health Committee. Mukesh, Hackerwell, Trina Gregory and I have worked in the last 10 years on the National e-Health Record System. One of the things that we've learnt, and I think one of the things Mukesh brought home to me very clearly, is that healthcare is actually about the patient. It's not really about the healthcare provider, it's the patient journey. And whilst we have a great healthcare system in Australia, you see there's a massive inequities all over the country. Tom was fortunate to get a liver transplant because we were able to get into the right people. But in Canberra and Darren, this is one for you, real problem, and this is a national problem, no Medicare rebates for MRI scans, no Medicare rebates for PET scans. Tom had to go through extraordinary processes to get to them. We would like to do something to change that. And I'd like to work with you. I'm also on the board of Peninsula Health in Melbourne, and the certain health minister tends to walk through our hospital quite regularly. We'd like to be able to get to the right people to be able to change some of these things so we get equitable rebates for the right procedures. The issue of advanced care directives or living wills is a really important one. We learnt that on the journey, that going around, that depending on which state you're in, whether the legislation applies or not, it's obviously going to change in Victoria. We have a national e-health record system, which next year becomes a opt-out system. 25 million Australians will be able to put an advanced care directive or living will onto that directory, but whether it has any currency or not is another question. So we'd like to work with the politicians, with the relevant healthcare providers, with the media to try and change some of these things so we end up with an open access system so that people's preferences can get reflected accordingly and they get the right healthcare at the right price at the right time.
You're right on that. Long before, thanks. It's a very good point. It's not just the rebates. Long before I decided to get into politics, about 2014, I remember in an article I'd written or a book I was writing, I said there should be a system whereby if you want to donate a kidney to your child, you should be getting some pay. You should be getting wages for it because you've got to go into hospital. You're out of action for 3 or 4 months. Your family says, well, you can't be out of work, and etc. And at the time, when I floated this, the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, the Sunday Telly, said Hinch wants to sell organs, for money. But the point I was trying to make is you should be rebates, there should be wages, and that way you can. I hate the idea that a child doesn't get an organ because they can't go on the dole. And so and I'm happy to talk to you about it down the track because there's a lot of areas we can cover.
Can I just ask another, Tom, would you like to make a comment about that?
Yeah, no. I'll just make a short comment, but during my stay in hospital and even before I got the transplant, I went through a fairly intensive education process. And this is part of what goes on prior to receiving a transplant. You talk to any number of members of the team and they both have an opportunity to assess you, I guess, and also to get feedback from you. One of the things that was emphasised very strongly was their belief in the importance of patients, particularly post-transplant, having a MediAlert bracelet or medallion, which is great. And it's a badge of honour. I've got it on today. I notice Andrew's got it on. I don't know whether Darren's got it as well or not. But, what it does is, presumably, if you find yourself in an emergency, you end up in a hospital, they can fairly quickly identify the fact that you're a transplant patient. Terrific advantage, and they can then contact the Austin and get some direction as to the way you should be treated. However, one of the things that I feel as somebody who's done a bit of work and worked on the issues surrounding e-health is that that there isn't enough emphasis in terms of the education provided to transplant patients and prospective transplant patients around the importance of getting a My Health record and having an electronic record of your treatment, your medications, what's happened to you in terms of discharge and so forth. This is just not emphasised. At the Austin, I have to say, it wasn't mentioned once, even though there is some mention of it in literature. But, as opposed to the Media Alert, where you're constantly being reminded and people are shoving the brochure in front of you. I think, I think we really, the day has come where we really need to start looking seriously at having some technological tools there to help patients and ensure that patients are receiving the right treatment if they come in emergency situations. This doesn't just apply to transplant patients, of course. It applies to anyone who's particularly those who have got a chronic condition. So,
on that same issue, I had a similar situation in Dunedin, in South Island of New Zealand a couple of years ago. Foolishly trying to impress a younger woman, I went heli riding on a mountain in Queenstown, just outside of Queenstown. Came off the mountain bike a couple of times, broke my back and a couple of ribs, and ended up spending 6 hours in Dunedin Hospital, where they thought I needed morphine, and I said I wasn't allowed it. So they happened to have a former doctor at the Dunedin Hospital who trained there by the name of Bob Jones, and so they phoned him in Melbourne, and Bob said, "Yeah, I think he could have some." So so I had the medical alert. But your point is very, very, very valid, and I should be wearing one of those. I didn't even think about it.
As someone who does a lot of clinics, what you do find when you go to clinics is there's a mountain of paperwork associated with your case, and I think to have that electronically there would be a great idea. It also gives that relational databasing an opportunity to exist, so doctors can get to information, I would assume, a lot quicker.
I think you'd have a lot of agreement in the room on that. We're going to take a question over here, and then I've got one last question for you to wrap it up.
My name's Izzy Cook, and I'm from Kilvington Grammar, and I pose my question to the whole panel. Seeing as organ transplants are a very expensive procedure, it's a privilege that only some can receive, do you see in the near future any possibility for cost reductions to make it more accessible to Australians, but also overseas to some developing countries, and allow them to receive such procedure?
That's a great question. It is expensive. There's no doubt about it. A lot of your taxpayer, a lot of your money is going onto this. But we actually think it is cost effective, because actually dying's pretty expensive, interestingly. It's actually not expensive at the hospital. Much cheaper if someone comes in with liver failure and dies than if we transplant them. But there's a huge social cost to dying, particularly if you're of a productive age and you've got kids. So there are actually some quite good studies showing it's actually extremely cost effective. And kidney transplantation, in fact, is extraordinarily valuable. I mean, to keep someone on kidney dialysis, a couple $100,000 a year, and within a year or so of transplantation, we're making money on that deal. So that's where the utility comes in. If I was the government, I'd be out there promoting organ donation purely for financial terms. You donate your organs, you're going to save the country money. It's still a very basic and primitive procedure. And look, we're taking an organ out of someone who died and putting it into someone else. That we'll look back and say, my God, those were the dark ages. And maybe with stem cells and, we'll be able to regenerate livers in a patient without doing this. So I think the future will be not doing solid organ transplantation, it'll be organ regeneration. But I reckon, it's going to be 20 years before we even see anything vaguely like that.
Well, on the same thing, one of your colleagues, Graham Starkey, said to me after my operation, he said, one day they will look back and say, you took bits from dead people and put them into live people? What sort of barbarians were you? And his theory is that within some years, you'll have a Petri dish and you'll pull it out and you'll say, this is for a 10-year-old, this is for a 20-year-old, this is for a 40-year-old. So that's what you hope. The other thing about the cost of it is that I think I'm right in saying that all of us with private insurance, some of that money goes into the public purse every day, doesn't it, from your private insurance? A certain amount of dollars per night goes into the... So everybody... So it's not whether you're wealthy or not, whether you get transplanted, because it's a public hospital.
Now, we're fast approaching 2 p.m, so I just have one last thing that I really wanted to ask you all to wrap up with. Overseas, there are many different models, and I believe in Israel, for example, you cannot receive a transplant unless you are signed on the register to donate. Can you all share one thing, if you can think of one thing, that you think that Australia should adopt in terms of policy to improve donation rates? Who would like to go first?
Well, you know, I think that as a matter of public policy, we should have an opt-out instead of an opt-in policy. I understand there are reasons why not to have it at the moment, but I think accompanied by a publicity campaign, a government, and some more government advertising, I guess, to explain that, I think it would be. It's a psychological thing, I guess. That's my feeling.
I think it's a terribly vexed question. I personally believe that in cases where families object to a transplant or organ donation, that the wishes of the family should prevail. However, I think that there's a couple of things, so I won't limit it to one. I do think that some form of opt-out is probably the preferable way to go. How that's done, Helen was saying to me earlier that in New South Wales they had a situation where you had a yes-no option when you got your licence, and 30% of people chose the no, therefore excluding any possibility that their organs could be used for donation. Well, I think if it's put as that sort of stark choice, then a lot of people are going to get nervous and are going to say no. I think the opt-out, basically, I think that it should be just a case of, well, look, we assume that that you will be, or your organs will be available for donation. I think that's similar to what they do in Spain, which has the highest rate of organ donation in the world. The other point I'd make is that we've had a fabulous increase in Australia in the number of organs that are available for donation. And I think a large part of that has been the work that's been put into making teams in hospitals available to identify people who are potential donors and work with their families in explaining what's involved in that and helping them overcome the fears and reticence that I think is only natural in that sort of situation. So I think, a continuation. I do think probably in the future, I hope that we have an opt-out system, and I hope we continue to put money and resources into identifying those situations where organs can be made available.
Two quick things. One, the idea of the driver's licence, yes or no. A bloke not too far from me, Bob Jones, said once that the wrong question's on the licence. It should say, not will you be an organ donor, it should say, will you accept a donated organ? And you might get 95% of people who say, yes, certainly will. Some people, of course, some traditionals in New Zealand, the Maori, who believe you should bury the placenta at birth, the whole body should go back into the earth afterwards, so they are not prone to donating their organs, but I'm sure they would accept one. I'm going to disagree with you on one thing. I think the rate of organ donation in this country is a bloody disgrace. There's only about, we said 1,700 people got them. That's from less than 500 people in the whole country in a year. And I used to get angry with Donate Life, I know that they're involved here, when they would dress it up. The percentages increased like this year. The percentage is up. I want people to say, it's a disgrace, get out there, get more. That's the way we're going to do it, not by saying how wonderful it is, they're all being increasing it, okay?
Well, I just perhaps follow on what Darren said. I remember an anecdote, just very briefly, a little while ago, talking to some 10, 11, 12-year-olds and asking who would want to be an organ donor. And a few kids put their hands up, where clearly the families have talked about it. And then you say, who's got a brother or sister? And you pose the question, they're dying of liver disease, who would want them to be transplanted? And all the kids put their hand up. They got it immediately. The question isn't, do you want to be an organ donor? It's whether you want to be transplanted. If your child got sick tomorrow with an acute fulminant liver failure, would you want them transplanted with whatever organ it was? And that's the question. That's why we do it. Not because we want to be donors. And you've got to be in it to win it. We've all got to be in it just in case we need it.
And one last final word from Andrew.
Sorry, I'm just cribbing an extra answer here, but it's a plug really. There's some wonderful people that Donate Life, and one of the things that if you haven't done it and you believe in it is go to donatelife.gov.au, register to become an organ donor, and more importantly than that, tell your family and friends that that's what your decision is, because that's one of the things that will make a huge, huge difference.
And the living will be here, I promise.
All right, thank you so much. It's been a fabulous conversation, and it is extremely easy to sign up. I actually Googled it on my way in, and it comes up very mobile friendly. So if you haven't signed up, sign up on your way out today. And thank you all for your attendance, your fantastic questions, and that's it.